The lawsuit felt like a joke in my hands. A piece of high comedy so dry and absurd, I had to read it twice to believe it wasn't a prank. A process server, a kid with a nervous tic and an ill-fitting suit, had handed it to me at the door of our lake cabin, offering a mumbled, insincere apology before practically sprinting back to his car. Now, standing in the quiet, sun-drenched living room that smelled of old cedar and fresh coffee, I held the document that officially declared my wife a public menace. The plaintiff was listed as Janice Peterson, in her official capacity as president of the Whispering Cove HOA. The defendant was my wife, Sarah Collins. And the charge, the central grievance upon which this entire legal farce was constructed, was for causing community-wide distress and endangerment through the open and flagrant display of a deadly weapon in a Nepal. Residential setting. I let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. The sound was swallowed by the heavy timber walls of the cabin. A lawsuit. Janice Peterson was suing my Sarah for wearing a gun. It was like suing a fish for being wet. It was like suing a master chef for holding a knife. It was a category error so profound, so steeped in a particular brand of terrified suburban ignorance, but it was almost sublime. Our cabin, a simple, beautiful structure of stone and timber, had been in Sarah's family for 3 generations. It sat on 5 acres of pristine woodland on the secluded northern shore of Whisper Lake. Our land was a private, legally distinct parcel, deeded and recorded long before the concept of Whispering Cove was ever a glimmer in a developer's eye. The Cove was a new community, a sprawling development of massive, architecturally homogeneous houses built on the opposite shore. Its residents had bought expensive homes with a view of the lake, and with that purchase, they seemed to believe they had also acquired a controlling interest in the lives of everyone on it. Their de facto ruler was Janice, a woman who had moved from a high-pressure marketing job in the city to a life of high-pressure meddling in the country. She saw our quiet, rustic homestead not as a piece of history, but as an untamed, unregulated threat to the sterile perfection of her community. The incident that sparked this legal inferno had happened 2 weeks prior, on a perfect Saturday afternoon. Sarah was down on our private dock, preparing for the upcoming National Practical Shooting Championship. To the uninitiated, it might have looked alarming. To anyone with a modicum of knowledge, it was a display of supreme professionalism. My wife, Sarah Collins, was not just a gun owner. Sarah was a master of her craft, a prodigy of discipline and skill. By the age of 30, she had won the national championship 3 times. Her nickname in the competitive circuit was Hawkeye for her almost supernatural accuracy. But her passion wasn't just in competition, it was in education. She was one of the most sought-after firearms instructors in the country, contracted by state police academies, federal agencies, and even elite military units to overhaul their training programs. She taught safety, precision, and the immense responsibility that came with carrying a firearm. The gun holstered on her hip was not a weapon in the way a thug's pistol was. It was a tool, an extension of a lifetime of dedication and respect. On that particular afternoon, she was running drills on our dock. She was practicing her draw from her competition holster, using her favorite pistolan unloaded, triple-checked Sig Sauer P320. She moved with a fluid economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch, a dance of muscle memory and intense focus. She was in her sanctuary, doing what she loved, on the property that had been her family's for a century. The problem was the new community dock that the Whispering Cove HOA had just installed directly across the small 100-yard-wide channel of water. On it were Janice and a group of her friends, sipping white wine and enjoying the sun. They saw Sarah. They didn't see a world-class athlete training for a national title. They didn't see a professional honing her skills. They saw a woman with a gun, and their placid afternoon shattered into a million pieces of
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
And their placid afternoon shattered into a million pieces of imagined fear. Janice, true to form, didn't hesitate. She didn't call from her dock. She and two of her friends got into her golf cart, drove around the long way to our access road, and confronted Sarah at our property line, right where the gravel of our drive met the perfect asphalt of her domain. I was up at the cabin, cleaning gutters, but I heard her shrill voice carrying across the water before I saw her. I walked down just in time to witness the main event. "You!" Janice had shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at my wife. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? You are waving a gun around. There are children here. You are terrorizing us." Sarah, who had holstered her pistol the moment she saw them approaching, simply stood there, her expression one of immense calm and weary patience. "Janice," she said, her voice even, "I am on my own property. I am a certified professional, and I am training in a perfectly safe manner. The weapon is unloaded and has been safety checked multiple times. You are in no danger. I don't care if it's Pungra." "Us?" "Unloaded," Janice screeched. "The sight of it, the aggression, it's threatening. We moved here for peace and safety, not to be confronted by people like you." The implication hung in the air, thick and ugly. Sarah's composure didn't crack. "My training is not a threat. It is my profession. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to get back to it. You are welcome to stay on your side of the property line." The dismissal, so calm and final, sent Janice into a fresh spiral of outrage. She had sputtered threats of calling the police, of filing complaints, of making sure everyone knew what kind of person Sarah was. We had simply turned and walked back to our cabin, the sound of her receding tirade following us like a foul odor. True to her word, Janice launched a full-scale propaganda campaign. An email went out to the entire Whispering Cove mailing list, a masterpiece of fear-mongering about the armed and potentially unstable individuals living on the North Shore. She posted blurry, zoomed-in photos of Sarah on the dock to the community's private Facebook page, framing her as a menace to society. Then came the official-looking letters from the HOA, citing non-existent bylaws and fining us for activities that cause undue alarm to the community. We ignored them, as they were legally meaningless. We knew our rights and the boundaries of her authority, but I had underestimated the sheer vindictive power of her ignorant fear. When her letters and social media posts failed to elicit the response she wanted, she had escalated. She had taken the HOA's money, hired their lawyer, and filed a civil suit. I stood there in the living room, the lawsuit clutched in my hand. Through the window, I could see Sarah down on the dock. She was sitting on the edge, her back to me, not training, just watching the sun glitter on the water. This place was her refuge from a world of noise and chaos, a place where she could connect with the legacy of her father and grandfather, both of whom had taught her to shoot, to respect the land, and to suffer no fools. And now, that too was under assault. I walked out onto the porch and down the stone steps toward the lake. She heard my footsteps and turned, a small, welcoming smile on her face. Her smile faded when she saw the document in my hand. "What's that?" she asked, her eyes immediately sharp and perceptive. "It's from Janice," I said, handing it to her. "She did it. She's actually suing you." Sarah took the paper and read it. Her expression didn't shift to anger or fear. It settled into a look of deep, profound weariness, the look of a master craftsman being told by a child that she is holding her tools all wrong. She read the absurd charge, the demand for damages for emotional distress, and then she looked up from the page, her eyes meeting mine. A flicker of something hard and resolute entered her gaze. "Well," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the clarity of a steel bell, "I guess we'll have to show the judge my credentials." Our preparation for court was less a frantic legal scramble and more a quiet, methodical assembly of a professional portfolio. We hired a lawyer, a sharp, sensible woman named Ms. Albright, primarily to handle the procedural aspects. The core of our defense, however, was curated by Sarah herself from a lifetime of achievement. While Janice Peterson was likely rehearsing her tearful testimony of terror, my wife was in her workshop, calmly organizing a case file that would dismantle their entire lawsuit with the overwhelming force of documented chaos. Fact. The file was beautiful. It contained, of course, the deed and survey maps of our property, establishing our clear legal right to be there. But that was just the appetizer. The main course was Sarah's professional life, laid bare in a thick 3-ring binder. There were the framed certificates from her 3 national championships, the glossy magazine covers from shooting sports journals that hailed her as one of the greatest practical shooters of her generation. There were letters of commendation from the police chiefs of 3 major cities, thanking her for redesigning their officer qualification programs. There was a plaque from the Federal Law Enforcement Agency, one whose name still gave me pause, praising her for her invaluable consultation on firearm safety protocols for high-risk teams. My favorite piece of evidence was a series of photographs. One showed Sarah, her face calm and focused, demonstrating a proper grip to a line of enormous, heavily armed SWAT officers. Another showed her standing with a United States Senator after she had provided an expert demonstration on firearm safety for a congressional committee. She wasn't just a gun owner, she was the person the most serious people in the country turned to when they needed to understand firearms. Watching her prepare, I felt a swell of pride so fierce it almost hurt. The world saw a quiet, unassuming woman. They had no idea of the steel in her spine, the sheer depth of her competence. This small suit wasn't just an attack on her hobby, it was an attack on her identity, her life's work, and she was going to defend it with the same quiet precision she applied to everything else. The day of the hearing arrived. The small claims courtroom was drab and smelled of stale coffee. Janice and her contingent from the HOA were on one side, dressed in their best suburban armor, looking like a concerned delegation of victimized citizens. Janice was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue before the proceedings had even begun. Sarah and I sat on the other side with Ms. Albright, calm and composed. Sarah wore a simple, professional navy blue blazer and slacks. She looked like she was about to give a university lecture, not defend herself against a charge.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Like she was about to give a university lecture, not defend herself against a charge of terrorizing a neighborhood. Janice was the first to take the stand. Her testimony was a masterclass in performative fragility. She spoke in a trembling voice about the peace and tranquility of Whispering Cove. She described the afternoon in question in breathless, dramatic terms. "We were just enjoying the sunshine," she said, her voice cracking. And then I saw her, standing there with that weapon. She was whipping it out of her holster, aiming it. It was so aggressive, so violent. My friends and I were terrified. We have children who play here. How could we feel safe knowing there's someone like that, just across the water, armed and so flagrantly displaying it? She painted a picture of a rogue gun nut, a powder keg waiting to explode, turning their idyllic paradise into a landscape of fear. When it was Ms. Albright's turn to cross-examine, her approach was simple and surgical. "Miss Peterson," she began, "at the time of this incident, where were you standing?" On our community dock," Janice admitted. "And my client, Ms. Collins, where was she?" "She was on her own dock." "So, at no point did my client leave her own property?" "Then no. But and at any point, did you witness my client point her firearm at you, or at anyone else?" Well, no, but she was aiming it out at the lake. It was threatening. Are you a certified firearms instructor?" "Ms. Peterson?" "Ms. Of course not. But do you have any professional expertise in determining what constitutes safe firearms handling or training procedures?" "I don't need to be an expert to be scared." Janice shot back, her victim act cracking to reveal the anger beneath. "No further questions, Your Honor," Ms. Albright said calmly. When it was our turn to present our case, Ms. Albright simply stood and addressed the bench. "Your Honor, My client will not be taking the stand. We believe the facts of her professional life will serve as a sufficient response to the plaintiff's claims of endangerment and distress. She walked forward with the heavy binder. We would like to submit into evidence a summary of my client's professional qualifications and achievements. She handed the binder to the clerk, who delivered it to the judge. The judge, a stern-looking man in his 60s named Judge Harrison, sighed. It was clear he viewed this as just another petty neighborhood squabble wasting his time. He opened the binder with an air of weary resignation. Then, everything changed. I watched him as he began to read. First, his eyebrows went up. Then, a small, incredulous smile began to play on his lips. He flipped a page, then another. He looked over the top of the binder at Sarah, a new light of recognition in his eyes, then looked back down at the paper, shaking his head slightly. Then he started to chuckle. It began as a low, rumbling sound in his chest, then grew into a full, hearty laugh that echoed through the silent courtroom. He laughed for a solid 10 seconds. Janice Peterson and her friends stared, mouths agape. Their lawyer looked utterly bewildered. Judge Harrison finally composed himself, though his eyes were still twinkling with mirth. He closed the binder and looked directly at a stunned and deeply confused Janice Peterson. "Ma'am," he said, his voice laced with an amusement he could no longer conceal. "Do you have any earthly idea who you are suing?" He didn't wait for an answer. He picked up a sheet from the binder. "You have filed a nuisance and emotional distress."
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
From the binder. "You have filed a nuisance and emotional distress lawsuit against Sarah Collins. According to this, you are suing the 3-time national practical shooting champion. You are suing the woman who literally wrote the revised safety handling manual for our state police. You're suing the lead firearms instructor for the Northern Federal Law Enforcement Training Center." He paused, looking at her over the top of his glasses. "Ma'am, you have brought a legal action against a woman who has received formal commendations for her safety instruction from the FBI's hostage rescue team. The most elite tactical units in this country trust my client to teach them how not to be a danger. And you are claiming she caused you distress by safely practicing her profession. On her own property?" He tossed the paper down on his bench. His amusement had evaporated, replaced by a flash of judicial anger. "This is not just a frivolous lawsuit. It is an embarrassment. It is a waste of this court's time, a waste of the plaintiff's money, and an insult to a distinguished and highly respected professional. Case dismissed, with extreme prejudice." He banged the gavel, the sound sharp and final. "And Ms. Albright," he added, looking at our lawyer, "I would be very receptive to a motion for sanctions to cover your client's legal fees. Very receptive." The humiliation for Janice was absolute and crushing. She sat frozen in her chair, her face a mottled canvas of shock and shame. She had been, quite literally, laughed out of court. We walked out into the bright sunshine, the weight of the last month lifting from my shoulders. Sarah was quiet, her expression one of quiet vindication. The news of the judge's reaction and scathing dismissal spread through Whispering Cove like wildfire. Within a week, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Janice Peterson was forced to resign as president after it was revealed she had spent thousands of dollars in community funds to pursue a personal vendetta she had so spectacularly lost. A few days later, I was sitting on the porch, reading a book. I looked up to see Sarah down on the dock. She wasn't training. She was just sitting on the edge, meticulously cleaning her competition pistol, the setting sun glinting off the polished steel. The motions were familiar, practiced, and peaceful. I brought her a cold beer and sat beside her. The water was calm. The air was still. Our sanctuary, her sanctuary, had been defended and reaffirmed, not with a weapon, but with the simple, undeniable weight of her own excellence. Her title, her life's work, wasn't just her defense. It was the ultimate, irrefutable answer to their ignorant fear.